not that, down to here, WAR file to deploy. Essentially, you'll export your solution from your application from Eclipse as a WAR file. And that's just you've heard of jar files, Java archive, this is web archive. They're all the same thing, they're just zip files full of stuff, and it's just packaged up in the right way. So you'll export as a WAR file, that's an option in Eclipse. You'll browse to it and deploy it here. And when you do that, it'll show up in this list up here. And to actually run the thing, I'm going to click on this one here and we'll see how it works. Let me increase the font. Okay, so the application, you're supposed to have 4 HTML files that are interlinked with each other, and then these 4 servlets here. And I've gotten lots of questions about the HTML files. They're just there to be there so that there's something for these servlets to report on, because these servlets keep track of activity in the application. And so that's just fodder. So it doesn't matter what's in those files, except I say there's supposed to be links in them. So if we come here, there's links to everything else. Just so you can click around, you quickly get a lot of hits on the application, so there's something for the logger to report. Then these are the servlets here that are actual Java programming. So there's no Java, there's no JSP, anything in all those. They're just straight HTML. And there's a session aspect to this, and there's an application aspect to this. And on the session page, if I click on session history, I've messed with the font, but anyway, that's hard to look at. What you've got on this page is a list of all of the accesses that have been made during the session to the application, during this browser session. So if I was in a different browser right now, I'd be seeing a different session history from what I'm seeing in Firefox, or in this version of Firefox. So if multiple of you are connecting, you see a different history. And so it's figured out what the browser is, what the date is, where the link was clicked. This, it's not exactly the URL, it's like parameters or something. Anyway, there's some information. So like I said, I don't know if this is even complete. I just picked it, looked at it 10 minutes ago. But anyway, there's some information I want to have about each connection. And then the other thing I want you to notice is, this has come up a lot. If you look at the address bar up there, you don't see something.jsp. You just see the name of the server. This is the way this is being implemented, I assume, and the way it should be, is you're accessing a servlet, and the servlet is doing some computation, and then it's invoking a JSP to output the material. But the JSP is hidden from the user. I can't browse directly to the JSP. Right, that's the session history. Then there's a similar page called application history, and it keeps track of all the links from all browsers across all sessions in the history of, like, as long as this thing's been run. Okay? So that's going to be a big, long history after a while. Then, well, actually, I can reset the session. So if I reset it, it should go blank until I, presumably if I visit it. I would have expected that to show up. Since I just visited this page, it should have shown up. So that's not quite ready yet. Okay, so there's something. Anyway, you can reset, you can force it to refresh. Each of those is showing up as a hit, actually. And then I can cause it to automatically refresh. So if I click here, what should happen is every 10 seconds, it should refresh a session history. So if I'm on another tab, simultaneously accessing, this thing ought to be refreshing. Yeah?
Do you care if it refreshes it from the server side, or?
Well, the data has to come from the server side. You have to, every 10 seconds, you got to contact the server and find out, get a new version of the page. There are a couple ways to do that. I talked about using the refresh header. That's what I had in mind when I wrote the assignment. You could also, there are timers in JavaScript that you could use to trigger a refresh. But, it's going to take a, I think you can see it refreshing here. It's going to take a trip to the server to get it. Now, preferences. So I come here to session preferences. Now, I'd ask for all these things to be sticky, and so really what I'd expect to see is, if you pick something, it should stay picked. You should see what's been picked. And what has happened here is, we go back, there's application preferences. So these are global preferences. So I can say, okay, make the font size medium, and make the font color black, and make the background color line, and submit. And now I've sort of changed the preferences for the entire application. And so when I go visit another page, I go to the index page, and I come back, let's say, look at application history, then those choices that I made should be used to format the page. So all four of these servlets should follow that formatting information. Now, if I go back to the index and I visit, let's say, session history, you see I see the same thing. So it's these preferences are applying to the whole thing. However, if I go to application preferences, I can override for a given session preferences. I can override these choices just in the current session. So if I decide in the current session I'd like to have a background color that is purple.
You're in application preferences right now.
Oh, I am application preferences, okay. It's just mislabeled. Okay, so if I'm a background color of purple, then I've got the purple background color, so it's overridden the application choice. And then if I go back to the index, I should see purple in every page I visit, so that's not quite right there either. That should be purple. Now there it is, I reloaded it. Although it should be saying, I think this is the application preference page, I'm not sure. Anyway, the choices I made should be displayed here, they should be sticky. But if I go to some other, if I put the Internet Explorer and visit it now, I have a line background because that'd be a different session. So I'd be using the application default that was chosen, but I wouldn't be seeing the session overlays.
So the session overrides the application.
Right, in the session. Yeah. Sort of like cascading style sheets. So there's a default, there's some global default, which is probably like white and black or something. Then you can override that at the application level, and you can override individual sections of the session. So in terms of programming, you've got to gather statistics about the requests that are being made. Like, I think you're supposed to keep track of how many distinct browsers you've communicated with, all the requests that have been made, and so on. So that's part of the programming. You've got to keep track of these preferences, and at the application of the session level, and then apply them. Okay.
How distinct do you want for the different browsers? Because a lot of them will say Mozilla, and then they have more information to be able to tell.
Well, when I say I want to have any distinct browsers, I mean physical software installation. So if all of you are using identical versions of Firefox, and you all have contact, I should count, 40 separate browsers. So it's not browser types.
It's different.
There may be places where I said browser type, but there is a place where I talk about distinct browsers. I want to know, was it this browser or that browser? Not what kind of browser it was, but whose browser it was. So how are we going to do that? How are we going to keep track of, figure out how many distinct browsers we talk to?
Cookies?
Right. You've got to mark you've got to have a cookie you use to mark every browser you've seen. And so I get to a browser that doesn't have my cookie in it, I'll mark it with a cookie. And then when I see it again, I'll know I've seen it before. But someone else contacts me and it doesn't have that cookie. I set the cookie in that, and now I've marked it. So you use long-lived cookies to mark these browsers so that you can tell them apart. Okay. Now what about things like application preferences and session preferences? How are we going to store those? Well, we're storing on the server side. Now we tell the sessions apart. Java will automatically set session cookies for us, so we can tell the sessions apart. So if you got to record the default session color, foreground color, background color, and font size, where are you going to record it? In the session, just like in PHP. there's a session object that you can set attributes on in Java. It works just like the session object in session array in PHP. So there's where you store those preferences. And then for application, there's something I've mentioned that's in Java, that's not in PHP. There's a context object in Java that's global to the entire application. And you set it has attributes as well. So you'd store the application preferences at that level in the application context, the servlet context object. Okay? Now, when I wrote the assignment, I was thinking, okay, how will they log? They've got to log every request. They've got to take every request, examine the headers, and save some information away. Well, you can save the information away easily enough in the servlet, in the session object or in the context object as appropriate. But when will the code run that logs things? And I figured, okay, the servlet's invoked, it can log itself, and then it can go do its, every servlet will log itself in the same way. And then it will go about its business, the individual business of the servlet. But what I'd forgotten was these 4 HTML pages, actually the 5, the index and the other HTML pages are also going to be accessed, and they need to be logged, and they don't trigger any code running. So I sent out some mail over break, try to explain how to do that, and let me show you this little application. So this is the filter example I've got deployed on it's at least on the repository. And what I can do, it just counts how many requests have been made in the current section. So if I click here, it says 5 requests made, 6, 7. If I back out and go to another page, go back, it's gone up to 9 now because I hit the page a couple times. Okay? And it's using something called a filter, and that's what I want to show you here, because this will be useful for your assignment. So here we have a filter. All right, so a filter is just a class, except it's a class that implements the filter interface as opposed to a servlet's a class that extends the servlet class, the built-in servlet class. And the way to think about a filter is every request that comes into the browser, to the server, is going to be routed through this filter. And you get to do whatever you want to, and then, let the request go forward. Although, actually, you can prevent the request from going through if you want to. So just think of it as some code that gets triggered automatically by Tomcat for every request. And actually, you can configure what it's triggered on. So here we have a class logger implements filter. Up here, this pattern, URL patterns equals, and there's only one pattern, /star. What do you suppose that means? Right, every URL, that matches against the incoming URL, the part after the domain name. And so this is going to say, this pattern will be, this URL will be applied to every single request that comes in. And you can specialize that so that it only applies to some requests that come in. So filters are a common way in Java. If you wanted to say do authentication, if you want to make sure that no one accesses anything without being logged in, you could put the login check into a filter. Because the filter will intercept every request, make sure the user is authenticated before allowing it to go through. We're using it for a different purpose. So the main method you have to override is doFilter. And doFilter gets as parameters the request object and the response object. So it accesses the same 2 things that a servlet has access to. And all we're going to do is just look at the request object. We're not going to modify the request object, although we could. And we're not going to modify the response object, although we could. I mean, we could write this code so that it just ignores the servlet and does something, sends something back on the response object, or it does that to some circumstance. So let's see what we do. This is actually a servlet request object. In reality, it's an HTTP servlet request object. So the first thing I do is I cast it to HTTP servlet request. And then all I have in my session, so request.getSession is the session object. I go and I look and see if it has a count attribute. And it will. It'll always have a count attribute except for the very first time that this filter is triggered. So I go and I get the count attribute, and if it's null, I set it to 0. I set this integer variable to 0, this count here. Then I increment it, and then I store it back. So I'm using this count attribute on the session object to keep track of how many times this filter's been triggered, how many requests it made. And then, after I've done that, I just pass the buck. So this is what the filter does. It just, this call here just says, okay, proceed with whatever comes next, which may be the servlet that was being invoked, it may be the next filter. There could be a chain of filters that are going through. Anyway, this just sends it on down the chain. So by interposing this filter, I don't have to, I don't have to put this counting code in every servlet and arrange or figure out how to invoke it for every HTML page. It just gets invoked automatically. Okay. Now, if I wanted to record this here, I'm recording stuff in the session. I mentioned there's the servlet context. So if I say request dot get servlet context. No, I'm not typing very well. Anyway, it's called get servlet context. That returns an object that works just like the session object, except it's global to the whole application as opposed to specific to each application. So if I did that, I'd be maintaining a single count for the entire application, not for each individual session. If I use the servlet context instead of if I just change get session up there to get servlet context up there and right here, then I'd have a global kind of count. And then the last bit, the code that actually shows the count, all it's doing is dispatching to this count.jsp page right here. So there's really nothing, there's almost nothing in this file of interest. And I'll show you the JSP page and we'll be done with this example. Count.jsp. And all it's doing is saying there have been $count page requests made. And so remember what happens when you refer, this is a little bit of the expression language. Variables in the expression language count refer to attributes defined in the context or the session or the request or the page. So it's going to be looking up through those scopes for a count variable. It's going to find it up in the session object. And it'll just echo it out. Yeah?
How does it handle similarly named, or it's just going to go with whichever one it finds first, right?
First one it finds first. It starts with the smallest scope, which is page scope. Those would be variables that were set in the JSP. Then it would go up to variables set in the request object by the servlet, and then up into the session, and then up to the context. There is a way to qualify it so that it goes to the scope you want it to go to. But usually you just, you're in charge, so you just use unique variable names, and it's not fun. Okay, so I've been talking for a while here, trying to give you an idea of what this application is supposed to do. See if there are any questions.
How much parsing do you have to do on the user indicators? So does that impact the browser text?
Just minimal. Just whatever the minimum amount of browser is, to tell what it's. I think you have to distinguish between Firefox, Safari, Chrome, and IE.
So there are a list of browsers that identify the expressions.
Yeah, I think I said at least those 4. Yeah.
Can you show real quick where that count variable is declared or used in the other project?
Okay, so you see it referred to there. Here's my logger. It's right here. So there's the set and the get attribute. So there's the get attribute method up there. There's a set attribute down here. So I'm basically setting attributes on the session object. And when I use a variable like that in the JSP, it's basically generating code which looks up. It calls get attribute on these context objects until it finds the thing to find.
So is the session actually like a copy of what's on the person's computer?
No, the session object is on the server side.
It's on the server side.
All the cookie is a, yeah. So there are a bunch of sessions going on at the same time. So the server is maintaining a hash table full of session objects. And the keys into that hash table are the values of the cookies that are stored in the browser. So all the browser has is a session ID. That session ID is used as a key into the master hash table by the server to pull out the right session object that it then populates. You got to be careful about storing data as a, typically when you store a cookie, it has a name and a value. Not typically, it always has a name and a value. And the value, you generally want to be some sort of key that makes sense to the server. You want to try to avoid storing lots of data as the value of a cookie that gets sent back and forth and parsed every time it comes to the server. Because there's a limit on the total number of bytes of data that you can store in a browser. It's like 4K. And so it's supposed to be applied, it can be applied across all cookies from that domain name. And so you run out of space in your browser to store the cookies. In your user's browser. So just store a little bit of information that you can use as a key back on the server. Yeah.
If on that line, you don't use get session and you just do direct set attribute, where is that stored?
Okay, so you can say request dot set and get attribute. That's called a request attribute. And that's just stored in the request object. I mean, it's just...
So unless you say get session, it's not stored in the session.
Right. Right. So very often, if you just got to decide, you got to communicate information to JSP, and you can do it by setting a request attribute or a session attribute or a context attribute. And it just depends on how long you want that information to be saved. If you store it in the request attribute, it'll disappear after this request. That's often what you want with form data that's been submitted. You do some calculations. If data you have is only pertinent for the current request, so you just put in the request object. If it's something like a color preference that applies to the whole application, you store it in the server context object. If it's something for the session, you store it in the session object. But you access it in the JSP the same way. It doesn't really matter.
You can store custom objects into the session and into the application context, is that correct? Or is it just key value pairs?
Well, it's key value pairs, but if you look at the signature for set and get attribute, it takes in objects. So usually the key is a string. The value can be any object. And the JSP takes care of casting it when it comes out. When you notice I have to cast it, when I do the get attribute, I have to cast it to integer because it's not a generic, it's not declared as a generic of any kind. It's just an old style object to object hash table that's used. Yeah.
Is there a way that we can tell that our source code got across into our URL file? That doesn't seem like we can see it on the site.
No, you can't. You have to actually see if it came across. You have to be able to log into the server and unzip the WAR file. But there's just what he's saying is I ask you to submit your code with it. Just when you create your WAR file, there's just a checkbox that you check that says include source code. Because normally there's no need for the server to have the source code because it doesn't use it. But for grading purposes, we want to have the source code in that WAR file. So just be sure you check the box. And, if you mess up, we can figure it out. Work with you. Okay, and again, be careful when you go to this manager page. You could do a lot of damage by basically deleting all the other applications. So don't do that. We'll look in the logs and figure out who did it. Be manager. Okay, any other questions? It's a lot of details to pull together. I mean, we've seen lots of examples of using cookies and using sessions and using JSPs and on and on and on. And matter of pulling it all together. But there's a lot to figure out, you know. You've got to get Tomcat installed, and you got to get Eclipse installed, and you got to hook them up, and, yeah, Stefan's going to be busy. I told you also that I haven't had, last time I tried to use the version of Tomcat that comes with XAMPP, I didn't have any luck integrating it with Eclipse, so I just installed a new version of Tomcat. I heard from someone last night that seemed to have the same problem, so just get a fresh version of Tomcat to use.
I got to work with it, and
You did?
and not with the internal input.
Do you know if the CAD machines are already set up with it? Because I installed it at home, but like if I wanted to work up here.
I don't think so, but it's not really an install, it's just an unzip.
Yeah, that's true.
So it's nothing that you be really quick to do on your phone, your UK phone. And remember that from Eclipse, you can launch the server and then by clicking on the debug icon instead of the run icon. And now your server's running in debug mode, and you can debug your servlets just like you debug any Java program, set breakpoints and so forth. So it's pretty convenient. Okay, any last questions? Okay. What has disappeared? All right, I want to finish up an example